The courthouse buzzed with the low murmur of voices, lawyers shuffling papers, and the echo of footsteps across polished marble floors. It wasn't the kind of place one expected drama to unfold. Yet tension hung heavy in the air. At the defense table sat a man who looked out of place in civilian clothes. His posture was rigid, his jaw set, his dark eyes focused straight ahead. He wasn't there to testify. He wasn't there to plead. He was there because a bureaucratic mix-up had dragged him into a case he had nothing to do with. His name, Marcus Cole. What no one in that courtroom knew, what he chose not to flaunt, was that he had spent 15 years as a Navy SEAL, serving in the kind of missions no one admitted existed. The prosecutor smirked as he leaned in toward Marcus. "You don't look like much of a soldier," he said under his breath, loud enough for the nearest jurors to hear. "Maybe you're just another guy hiding behind a story." The words were cutting, but it didn't end there. When Marcus shifted his chair, the prosecutor accidentally kicked his leg under the table, a small act of mockery meant to humiliate him. A few snickers rippled through the courtroom. Marcus didn't flinch. Years of discipline had trained him to absorb worse without breaking. But the judge's gavel didn't fall. No reprimand was given. The silence of the room seemed to condone the insult. Then, Marcus reached calmly into his pocket and slid his phone across the table. One quick call. One voice on the other end. A voice the entire courtroom would recognize. Within minutes, the bailiff entered the chamber, whispering urgently to the judge. The judge's expression shifted from bored indifference to pale shock. The prosecutor froze mid-sentence. The jurors leaned forward, sensing the air shift, because that single call had connected Marcus to someone at the very top of the military chain of command. Someone who could end careers with a word. And in that instant, the laughter died. The courtroom wasn't mocking him anymore. It was holding its breath. The prosecutor thought he had the upper hand. As questioning began, he peppered Marcus with pointed remarks, each one more dismissive than the last. "So, Mr. Cole, you expect us to believe you served overseas. Interesting that you have no ribbons, no uniform, nothing to prove it. Perhaps you just enjoy playing dress-up for glory." The courtroom chuckled nervously, some jurors shifting uncomfortably. Marcus didn't rise to the bait. He sat still, hands folded. His calm unnerving in contrast to the lawyer's showmanship. "Answer me," the prosecutor pressed, stepping closer. "What makes you think anyone here should take your words seriously?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He could have listed the operations, the grueling hell weeks, the scars hidden beneath his clothes. But none of that was public record, nor would he dishonor his oath of silence for the sake of ego. Instead, he simply said, "You wouldn't understand." That only enraged the prosecutor further. "Oh, I understand plenty," he sneered, circling Marcus like a predator. "You're just another fraud looking for sympathy. A fraud in this courtroom, wasting everyone's time." He slammed his hand against the table for emphasis, the sound jolting the jurors. Then came the final insult, the shove. As he stepped past Marcus, the prosecutor's knee struck his chair deliberately, jarring him forward. It wasn't just mockery now. It was open humiliation. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge gave a token warning, but her tone lacked authority, as though she too underestimated Marcus. Still, the former SEAL didn't rise. He didn't lash out. His discipline held firm, his silence more commanding than any outburst could have been. Yet his eyes, cold, steady, unflinching, fixed on the prosecutor with a weight that made the man falter for just a second. And then Marcus reached for his phone. One press, one call, his voice low, steady, measured. "Sir, it's Cole. I need you to clarify something. Publicly, he set the phone face down on the table. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but the next voice to come through that speaker would rewrite the atmosphere entirely. The courtroom shifted uneasily as Marcus set the phone on the table. His composure never cracked, but his silence carried the weight of something unseen. The prosecutor smirked, thinking it was a bluff. What's this? Calling a friend to rescue you. Maybe they'll vouch for your story. His tone dripped, with mockery playing to the gallery of jurors. Marcus didn't answer. He tapped the speaker button. A crisp, commanding voice filled the room, echoing through the microphones. This is Admiral James Harrington, Chief of Naval Operations. Who am I speaking to? Every sound in the courtroom died at once. Chairs creaked as jurors leaned forward. Even the judge froze, her gavel suspended midair. The prosecutor's grin evaporated, his lips parting in disbelief. Admiral, Marcus said evenly, I found myself in a courtroom where my service is being questioned. I need clarification. Does my record still remain classified? The Admiral's voice came back sharp, cutting through the tension like steel. Yes, Commander Cole. Most of your missions remain sealed under Tier 1 clearance. You know that. Why are you asking? The prosecutor stumbled, his voice suddenly smaller. Commander, did he just... The Admiral continued without pause. Let me make this plain for anyone listening. Marcus Cole is one of the most decorated operatives this nation has ever produced. His service record isn't public because it involves missions that protected this very country from threats you'll never read about in the news. He has bled, he has buried brothers, and he has carried out duties that make this courtroom and its proceedings possible. The silence afterward was suffocating. The jurors shifted, their earlier skepticism melting into shame. The judge adjusted her glasses, her once steady authority faltering. But the Admiral wasn't done. His voice hardened, every syllable carrying a lifetime of command. Who in that courtroom questioned him? Who dared mock a man who has given everything for his flag? Because I will make it very clear, Commander Cole does not need to prove himself in your chamber. His proof lies in the freedom you take for granted every day. The prosecutor's face drained of color. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Admiral, I didn't realize. You didn't realize because you didn't respect him. Harrington cut in, his tone final. Learn this lesson well. Rank and uniform are not the measure of a warrior. Integrity is. And Marcus Cole has more of it than you will ever know. The call ended abruptly, leaving the room in utter silence. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't smirk, didn't rise to claim victory. He simply retrieved his phone, slid it back into his pocket, and sat with the same calm he had held all along. But the courtroom had transformed. The jurors no longer saw a man to be mocked. The judge looked at him with newfound respect, almost deference. Even the prosecutor, humiliated and shaken, could barely meet his eyes. What had started as an attempt to diminish him had become something else entirely. A lesson. For a long moment, the courtroom was frozen. The echo of Admiral Harrington's voice still seemed to linger in the chamber, heavy and undeniable. The once smug expressions of the jurors had evaporated. Some stared wide-eyed at Marcus. Others lowered their gaze, ashamed they had laughed just minutes before. The judge cleared her throat, her gavel resting uselessly in her hand. Her tone carried none of the earlier indifference. It trembled slightly with the weight of realization. Commander Cole, I owe you an apology. This court was not informed of your service record, nor of its classification. Had I known... Marcus raised a hand gently, cutting her off without disrespect. Ma'am, you weren't supposed to know. That's the point. My work wasn't for recognition." His words were calm, his voice steady, carrying the kind of authority that didn't come from a title, but from lived experience. The prosecutor, pale and sweating, stumbled forward. "Commander Cole, I didn't realize. I had no idea who you were." If I'd known, Marcus turned his gaze on him, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, he let a fraction of the steel in his eyes show. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect," he said quietly. "A man's dignity isn't earned by medals or rank. It's owed, regardless of what's on his sleeve or in his file." The words struck harder than any shout could. The prosecutor dropped his eyes to the floor, unable to answer. From the gallery, whispers rippled, shock, awe, regret. A woman, in the back row, a military spouse by the look of her, wiped her eyes. One of the younger jurors clenched his jaw, as if ashamed of having doubted the man sitting before him. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. The judge leaned forward, her voice softer now. "Commander, this court will make immediate corrections. You will not be subjected to further questioning regarding your service. In fact," she glanced at the prosecutor, her eyes narrowing with quiet fury, "this court will be reviewing the conduct displayed here today." Marcus nodded once, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. He didn't crave punishment for the man who had mocked him. Justice wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth being seen for what it was. Slowly he rose from his seat. The scrape of the chair legs against the polished floor echoed louder than the gavel had all day. He adjusted his plain jacket, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. And then he looked at the jurors, not with bitterness, but with the calm strength of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Some of you laughed," he said quietly, his voice reaching every corner of the room. "You saw a man who didn't fit your idea of a warrior. That's fine. But remember this: uniforms can be removed, medals can be hidden, records can be sealed. What cannot be erased is sacrifice. Many wear no ribbons, but carry scars you'll never see. Before you judge someone, think of what they might have given in silence." The room remained still. Even the court reporter's hands hovered above her keyboard, frozen mid-keystroke. With that, Marcus inclined his head respectfully to the judge. "Ma'am." He gave a short nod to the bailiff, then turned toward the exit. Each step he took was measured, steady, echoing across the marble floor like a cadence only he could hear. No one stopped him. No one dared. When the doors closed behind him, the silence remained, thick, unbroken. The prosecutor lowered himself into his chair, hands trembling, sweat dripping down his temple. The judge exhaled slowly, then finally spoke. Court adjourned. The gavel fell, but it sounded more like a confession than a command. Outside, Marcus stepped into the sunlight. The day was the same as when he had walked in. The streets bustling, the world moving as though nothing had shifted, yet for everyone. In that courtroom, everything had changed. The whispers would spread. The jurors would tell their families. The prosecutor would never forget the sting of his arrogance being shattered, and the judge would carry the weight of nearly failing to honor a man who had honored his country beyond measure. Marcus Cole, however, would simply go on with his life. He had no need for applause, no hunger for recognition. His battles had been fought in shadows, and he preferred to remain there. What mattered to him wasn't what people thought. It was that, in one courtroom on one ordinary day, a lesson had been seared into memory. When Marcus Cole stepped out of the courthouse, the blast of sunlight hit him like a cleansing fire. The hum of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, and the distant wail of a siren all blended into the background. He paused at the top of the courthouse steps, hands in his pockets, letting the warmth soak into him. To the onlookers, he was just another man leaving a building. But to those inside, he had become something else entirely. A mirror that had forced them to confront themselves. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't linger for gratitude. Marcus had long ago stopped expecting recognition. That was the paradox of his life. The more he gave, the less he was allowed to show. And yet, he was content. Still, as he descended the steps, he knew the courtroom behind him wasn't finished wrestling with what had just happened. The jurors shuffled out slowly, their earlier bravado gone. A few glanced at one another, unsure of what to say. One young man, no older than 25, muttered under his breath, "I laughed at him. I actually laughed." His voice cracked with guilt. An older juror patted his shoulder. "Don't dwell, son. Just learn from it." The prosecutor sat slumped in his chair, his face drained of color. His career, once polished with ambition, now felt brittle. His arrogance had cracked in front of everyone, and he knew it would follow him. He buried his face in his hands, the Admiral's words replaying over and over. The judge lingered on the bench long after adjournment. Her gavel lay still, useless. She stared at the empty defense table where Marcus had sat, haunted by her own silence during the mocking. She had allowed it to happen. She had underestimated him too. She whispered to herself, "Never again." Officer Ramirez, the bailiff, followed Marcus's retreating back with quiet awe. He had served 8 years in the Marines before taking this job, and though he hadn't made it past sergeant, he knew the look of true command when he saw it. As he escorted people out, he muttered to a colleague, "That man carried himself like he didn't need this courtroom, like he's already stood in worse places." His colleague asked, "Worse how?" Ramirez shook his head. "You don't get it. You could put him in the middle of a battlefield, bullets flying, and he'd still be calmer than we are right now. That's what real warriors look like." By the time Marcus reached the sidewalk, a few local reporters had gathered, tipped off about the heated exchange inside. Microphones thrust toward him, cameras flashing. "Mr. Cole, can you comment on what happened in there?" one asked, breathlessly. Marcus kept walking, his steps steady. "Nothing happened," he said calmly. "Just a misunderstanding." Another reporter pressed harder. "Is it true you're a Navy SEAL? Did the Admiral really confirm that?" He stopped then, turning to face them, his eyes, sharp and steady, cut through the noise. "I served my country. That's all you need to know. What matters isn't who I am. It's how we treat each other, even when we don't know their story." His words silenced the reporters. For a moment, their microphones drooped. They expected bravado, a soundbite of anger or pride. Instead, they got humility. Marcus walked on, disappearing into the crowd. That evening, the prosecutor sat alone in his office, his desk cluttered with untouched files. His phone buzzed constantly, messages from colleagues, reporters, even his superiors. Each one carried the same undertone, disbelief at his behavior. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared at the wall. All his life, he had believed intelligence and arrogance could carry him. He had mocked others, belittled those he thought beneath him. But today, he had crossed a line and been humbled in front of everyone. The Admiral's words echoed, "You didn't realize, because you didn't respect him." For the first time in years, he felt shame. He wondered if Marcus would ever forgive him. He doubted it, but perhaps forgiveness wasn't the point. Perhaps the point was learning. He scribbled a note on his legal pad. Respect isn't optional. Task home. Judge Whitaker sat in her study, staring at a faded photograph of her late father in uniform. He had served in Vietnam, had come home with scars he rarely spoke of. She realized now that she had nearly disrespected a man just like him because she hadn't looked deeply enough. She whispered to the photo, "I almost failed him today, Dad." But then she thought of Marcus's final words in the courtroom. "A man's dignity isn't earned by medals or rank, it's owed." She vowed never to let silence enable cruelty again. Marcus walked through the city until the courthouse was far behind him. He found a small diner, tucked into a quiet corner, and slid into a booth. He ordered black coffee, nothing more. As he sat there, he thought of the Admiral's voice booming through the courtroom. He hadn't wanted the call to become a spectacle, but perhaps it was necessary, not for him, but for them. His brothers in arms came to mind, men whose names would never appear in newspapers, men buried under headstones, marked only by rank and date, men who had laughed with him in foxholes and never made it home. He lifted his coffee in a silent toast. "For you," he whispered. By nightfall, the story had already begun to ripple. A juror told his family. A clerk whispered to a neighbor. A reporter drafted a careful article, stripped of classified details, but heavy with implication. Today, a man mocked another in court. The piece read. He thought he saw weakness. Instead, he saw silence, strength, and sacrifice. And when the truth was revealed, every person in that room learned a lesson they won't forget. Marcus Cole would fade back into quiet anonymity. Tomorrow, he would rise early, run his miles, and live without fanfare. That was who he was. But for everyone who had witnessed the courtroom that day, something had shifted. They would remember the silence after the call. They would remember the Admiral's words. And above all, they would remember the man who carried himself with such quiet dignity that it silenced arrogance itself. Because sometimes it doesn't take medals or uniforms to command respect. Sometimes it only takes one man standing tall, reminding the world that true warriors don't need to shout. Respect isn't given because of rank or skin or title. Respect is owed because sacrifice is real, even when unseen, and sometimes it takes only one call to remind the world of it.